Sponsored by Nordic Nordic House and the Department of World Languages here at PSU. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Elisabeth Ward from Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma. She is not a total novice to Scandinavian community here in Portland. Elisabeth is the director of the Scandinavian Cultural Center at the university, and last year Nordic House borrowed her exhibit. This was called Lutheran Education on the Frontier. And I was there and I saw her and I went and grabbed her and I said, would you like to speak at our Friday night? And she said, yes, and that's why she's here. When someone comes from all the way from Tacoma, they always need a place to stay. And my friend Nils Jensen there has been so nice to host Elisabeth. And I really appreciate that, Nils. You're always sweet. So let me tell you a little bit more about Elisabeth Ward. Elisabeth is half Icelandic. She just told me that her mother is Icelandic and her father was a pilot, the American pilot came up to Iceland. It was a really romantic thing. She could tell about this later. That's how she became half Icelandic. And she worked in Iceland from 2006 to 2010. She began studying Icelandic language and Scandinavian history at the University of California at Berkeley in 1992 in order to learn more about her heritage. She has turned that knowledge into an academic career in academia, but also in museums. She worked at the Smithsonian Institution between 1998 and 2003 as an assistant curator for a special exhibit about the Vikings entitled Vikings, the North Atlantic Saga, which depicted like Erik's discovery of North America 1,000 years ago. Elisabeth's primary interest is Icelandic Sagas that tells about the exploit of the Vikings, and that's what I really like. Since she returned to graduate school after working at the Smithsonian and at a museum in Iceland called Viking Age. If you don't know what it is, I can tell you. It's a world of the Vikings. After completing her PhD in 2012, Elisabeth was hired by Pacific Lutheran University to run the Scandinavian Cultural Center, where she used her knowledge of exhibits to create rotating display as well as teaching the Scandinavian Studies program. She works closely with the Scandinavian Cultural Center Council volunteers to create many other programs for people of Scandinavian and Nordic descent. This was a long introduction, wasn't it? If somebody comes all the way from Tacoma, they deserve it. So let me welcome Elisabeth, who is more than qualified to speak on the topic, the women of Vinland.
Well, it is, thank you so much for inviting me here tonight. I'm very excited to have I like to drive down here. It's a beautiful drive down from Tacoma, and even though it was raining quite a bit. And I was stopped in at the Nordic House, which is just a fabulous facility, and I cannot congratulate the community of Portland enough for the efforts. It took, I understand, 25 years of steadfast effort to make that house a reality, and did plans for expanding into the Fogelbud house next door. As it's just wonderful, and I'm so impressed with this community and how vibrant it's maintaining its sort of interest in Scandinavia. And the delight did not end there, because then I was taken to Neil's home for dinner, and I'm looking forward to a very cozy night in a fabulous location. So thank you for the welcome and for all of your efforts to keep knowledge of Scandinavia and a sense of community here in Portland. We're trying to do the same sort of thing up in Tacoma, and of course in Ballard, in the Ballard area of Seattle. So there's really a wonderful I-5 corridor and a lot of nice exchanges back and forth where we try to share programming. But it's nice to get a chance to give a talk here, and I thank you very much. I think that probably most of you know this general story of the Vikings, so I don't want to, let's see, how many people know who discovered North America first? And I know all of you know this map. When I have to teach freshmen, sometimes, you know, we have to say, okay, there's Norway, there's Sweden, there's Denmark, but we all know that well, this is what we would really call the Viking homelands. This part here of this area, especially this Vik, the valley, the fjord of Vik, is probably one of the leading contenders for where Vikings get their name from. They're from the Vik fjord here in between Norway and Sweden. So this is what we called in the project I worked on at the Smithsonian. This is a map from that project, Vikings, the North Atlantic Saga. And we talked a lot in that exhibition about the Vikings leaving their homelands. And what we usually talk about when we talk about Vikings is we talk about them leaving their homelands and raiding in France, and raiding in the Netherlands, and raiding in England. But what we wanted to talk about at the Smithsonian, because it was the 1,000-year anniversary of Leif Erikson's discovery of North America, we were much more interested in this western migration of the Vikings across the North Atlantic. And Vikings as settlers, Vikings as landnámsmenn, meaning people that are taking land as they're moving across the North Atlantic. So it's a little bit of a different type of story than you sometimes hear about the Vikings. And as Åsa mentioned, my mother's Icelandic, and I lived in Iceland for a while. And Icelanders even sort of hesitate to say those were Vikings that settled Iceland, because they think, well, they weren't bloodthirsty killers. These are our ancestors. They were just farmers who were looking for a nice place to settle. So in Iceland, they don't even like to necessarily use the word Viking. They like to say they were kind of pioneers or explorers or landnámsmenn. And my point is, it was taking place during the Viking Age by people speaking the same language as the Vikings and on Viking ships. So, pretty sure I would call those people Vikings, but you know, but it's all a matter of semantics, and it is different though than the kinds that were, you know, targeting churches for quick wealth. It's a different type of activity. But most of you, I think, I don't know, I can talk a lot about the Vikings. I have given impromptu lectures on Viking ships, so I'm happy to talk a lot more about the Vikings if you like, but I thought I'd instead spend more time tonight talking about one of the ways that one of the sources of information we have about the Vikings is the Icelandic Sagas. Of course, we also have archaeological evidence and historic evidence. But the Icelandic Sagas are an important source of information, particularly about this Western effort to go further. So I'm going to keep stepping on this cord. I don't trip. The story of from Iceland to Greenland to North America is really what I want to focus on tonight. And the archaeological evidence we have for that, and then specifically the written evidence that we have for that expansion. Okay, so we know that their navigation style, Viking Age navigation style, was sort of hit and miss, and the descriptions that are used in the written sources for how they sailed are a little bit unclear. If you were Viking, they probably would have been sufficient, but for us today we have to kind of piece it together. And one thing we believe is that from Greenland, if you go a little bit north of the Greenlandic coast, you get quite close to, you can't quite see Canada, but it's a lot closer and a lot quicker to go. So we believe the Vikings like to sail actually sort of east-west more than, or either along the coast or across the ocean directly. So this is probably the route they might have taken. So the archaeological evidence for this trek of especially Erik the Red, we've heard of Erik the Red, right? And the trek that we have found, the archaeologists have found evidence of his whole western migration, starting in Iceland, at a farm that today is still called Eiríksstaðir, Erik's place in Iceland. and it's on this west coast. It's on the west coast of Iceland here, in Breiðafjörður. So they did excavations of that in the late 90s, and I don't know if you can see the director of the Hopsos Immigration Center. You can see, it's not a very big house, right? It's not a very big house.
Only one bathroom.
Only one bathroom. I know. I don't know, yeah? I There you go. So you can see, this is that kind of construction, really neat, where they take the sod, and cut the sod, and especially in Iceland, also in Denmark and parts of northern Norway, there's not a lot of trees. So they did have this way of building homes that was used turf. They would cut into the grass and lay it up in sort of brick style. And they excavated Erik the Red's, well, Erik Staður in Iceland, and spent a long time excavating the whole thing. Discovered hardly anything. There was just very little. He was clearly quite poor when he was living in Iceland. It's both a small home and it had very little remains inside of it. But it fits in with what we know from the sagas of someone who had left Norway under duress. Anybody know the story? Erik the Red killed someone in Norway, so he had to leave Norway. And then he was living in northern Iceland, and he got in a fight with one of his neighbors, so he had to move to western Iceland. And then he got in a fight with another one of his neighbors in western Iceland. So then he leaves Iceland, and he's banished from Iceland for 3 years for being such a contentious character. So so I guess that's why the house is as small as it is, because he hadn't lived there very long, and he wasn't really sort of persona non grata. When he gets to Greenland, this is a drawing made by Daniel Brun in 1728 of Eiríksfjord in Greenland, and the farm of Erik the Red is sort of these are like the remains. He could tell, this Danish missionary could tell that there were remains of Viking Age style farms there in Eiríksfjord, but it had really reverted to wilderness. There were no descendants of the Vikings living in Greenland by the 1720s. So it's always been a little bit of a mystery. What happened to Erik the Red's settlements in Greenland? What happened to the people that went with him, left Iceland and moved to Greenland after he had named it so cleverly Greenland and managed to convince a bunch of people to leave Iceland and move to Greenland? But by 1728 they had all disappeared. And it was a big question of what happened to the descendants of Erik the Red, and all that was left was sort of this wilderness. So archaeologists have been trying to track down evidence of the Vikings' western migration to North America. Anybody here heard of the Newport Tower? Yeah. Kensington Runestone? Yes. Yeah. There's Boston has some stones in the harbor of Boston that say LEX1, meaning Leif Erikson 1001. So there's a lot of sort of spurious, inaccurate, questionable finds in North America about whether or not did the Vikings make it to North America or not. And it's been a subject of deep speculation. There are a few. Do you want me to turn on the lights for just a second so you guys can find a seat? There is a seat. I know there's a one here. Back there.
There's also one here.
There's some.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry guys, thank you.
Try not to step on toes.
Yes. You guys are impressively early, and I'm grateful that Neil's got us here early enough too. So archaeologists and historians had lots of ideas. There's a town in New Jersey named Vinland, because people were sure the Vikings had sailed all the way to New Jersey. Martha's Vineyard was a popular idea that the Vikings must have made it to Martha's Vineyard. So, but it took a Norwegian explorer. There you go. Okay. So this is Helgi Ingstad and his wife Anna Stina Ingstad. She was a professional archaeologist. He was a Norwegian politician. He was the governor of Svalbard for a while, but also an explorer and a sailor in his own right. And they took it upon themselves to really try to solve this mystery of, did the Vikings make it to North America or not? And if so, where did they go? So he and his wife discovered this spot, which is, as my map over here indicates, on the northern tip of Newfoundland Island. So a lot of people have speculated, they knew they left Iceland and got to Greenland. They knew Erik the Red had been in Greenland, but they didn't know where in North America. And if you look at it from this projection, it's quite clear that the northern tip of Newfoundland Island is a good spot. It's something you could return to from Greenland. If you were sailing there, you'd find it. If you go, this would also be a good spot, somewhere you could sort of easily recognize. If you go beyond that, the coastline really does start to, it's more open water than you'd imagine, unless you really hug the coastline. And this right here, the Bay of Fundy in here, has incredible currents. It's one of the highest sort of displacements. So this is not easy sailing, really. Whereas going inland into the Gulf of St. Lawrence is quite a bit more calm waters, although in general there are icebergs coming down here. The Davis Strait it's really treacherous to try to navigate this whole area. So they weren't doing this casually, and they weren't just sort of on a pleasure cruise down the coast of North America, is what Helge Ingstad figured, because he was a sailor himself. And he thought, no, they would have been as close to Greenland as possible. And so he really concentrated his efforts around Newfoundland and found this remains of some houses, some turf houses made of that same sort of pieces of grass, like Erik the Red's house had been. So after they spent actually 20 years excavating this site, I mean just every inch of it has been excavated, and this is what they found. Helge Ingstad did it, and then it went over to Parks Canada, and other archaeologists have been working there for a long time. They've done a lot of studies of it, and they've determined there are 3 much larger than that small hovel you saw, but that same type of construction made out of sod, and there are 3 large and then some other smaller buildings, as well as one over there that looks like they were smithy. It's a smithy for ironworking, and that's quite unusual because that technology, the ability to take slag and refine it well enough to make iron, was not, as far as we know, a technology that Native Americans knew. So that's one good piece of evidence that this is a Viking settlement. Vikings definitely knew how to work iron. But there's other things, the house construction style, and then they found there was lots of woodworking, evidence of using metal to work wood, and lots of nails here, and pieces of iron over there too. So if you're cutting wood, and you're using nails and iron, what are you probably building? Ships, yeah. We think they were building ships, especially this is kind of an unusual feature. It's open on one end, so it's probably a hut that they were using to sort of bring, where they would be working on the ship even during the winter time and be able to do some ship construction. There's no barn here, there's no graveyard here, there's very little to indicate a long-term settlement. So they were coming here, exploiting the trees in the area and the iron in the area, perhaps just repairing their ships or building several new ships. So there's a lot more I could say about Lansomeros, but it is today a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and they've reconstructed sort of off from their archaeological site. They've reconstructed a couple of those buildings, and you can go, and they have reenactors there showing you what life might have been like. And you get a sense, I like this photo because you really get a sense of this wasn't the kind of place that Vikings would have wanted to bring their animals and settle permanently, because it's a really windswept little point, rocky windswept point, but it would be easy to navigate back and forth to it. You'd find it because it was such a promontory out into the North Atlantic. But it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and if you ever get the opportunity to go up there, it would highly recommend it. Anybody been?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who said yes? I didn't. Sorry. Okay, right? It's spectacular.
It's spectacular, it's wonderful. It's very windswept and very lonesome and very forlorn.
Yeah. So it's that's why a lot of people, when Helge Ingstad reported on this, they were all like, "This is not what we were expecting. We were expecting, you know, Vinland, this place of grapes and honey and a much more hospitable environment." So as many of you might know, there are still archaeologists looking for another Viking site in North America. I understand National Geographic just came out yesterday with a new article, and one of the hot contenders is further down the coast. So that there's been some publicity recently about this satellite imagery that shows another site, and that would be down around here. And that certainly makes sense, that there might be something else on the island of Newfoundland where the Vikings might have spent more time. But thanks to the efforts of Helge Ingstad, we do have at least one confirmed Viking site, Helge in Anastina. Can't believe I just did that. It's a talk about Viking women, and I forgot to mention his wife, who was actually the archaeologist in the pair. So, sorry, Anastina and Helge Ingstad. Thanks to their efforts, we do have a sense of where at least one point the Vikings were. So the question is always, why didn't the Vikings stay in North America? And as many of us know, there is a strong native presence, especially around the Gulf of St. Lawrence, much more so than Iceland or Greenland. There wouldn't have been any native peoples in either Iceland or Greenland when the Vikings came across from Norway. But by the time they got to North America, it's a whole different story. They're about to encounter various different native groups, all of which were organized, well populated, and not thousands of miles from their home base. So the Vikings did not stay long in North America and returned back to Greenland, and then the Greenland colony collapsed and they returned to Iceland as sort of the furthest western point of Viking civilization. Okay, it's probably a story many of you already know. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what was the role of women in this western migration to North America. And I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from the sagas to tell you what the saga evidence is of women. But I first want to tell you what some of the archaeological evidence is for women being in North America. When I read, I'll have to turn the light on. But these, not a whole lot was found at Lansameadows, mostly really little iron nails and pieces of wood. But some of the other pieces found at Lansameadows includes this spindle whorl, right, which would have been used for making thread from wool or linen. You take a shaft, and then the spindle whorl is at the bottom, and it pulls out and the fibers, and it turns it into thread as it's spinning. So there's a spindle whorl. This bone pin could have been used for making, for sewing, making sails. They believe, at least this part of the site here, they think there was quite a bit of probably working wood artifacts and even some things that might have been used for weaving. So they believe they were making sails in addition to working wood for planks for a ship. This is a piece of schist. It's a very fine-grained stone that's used for sharpening knives. And it's really interesting because those show up really often in female burials. And the Viking women always have knives with them, and very often these kinds of little pieces of schist would be found there as well. This ring pin is probably actually from a man's cloak, but could have been worn by a woman. So, but we definitely believe that there were women, archaeological evidence that there were women at the site of Lansameadows. But the question, of course, is why did Erik and Leif get all the attention? Not that surprising, I suppose, from the point of view of what we know of Vikings in general and ship crews. You probably have a dominant person gathering together the crew, and everyone wants to go sailing with a lucky captain. And Leif had earned a reputation for being a good captain and a lucky captain. Erik the Red, not so lucky. I don't know if I would have gone on with him. But Icelandic sagas are really our main source of information about what happened in North America, where did they go, how long did they stay, and also, of course, for this question of were women on board, were women part of this, and what did the women do that were part of the expeditions to North America. So, who here's heard of Icelandic sagas before? Yeah, all right. Oh, my kind of people. All right. So I was talking to Niels. He said his favorite was Njál's saga. Anybody else have a favorite?
What story?
Huh?
Story Sturluson?
Snorri Sturluson wrote, yes, of course, the King sagas. Those ones are very important as well, and Heimskringla. So we were also talking about Egil's saga. Egil Skallagrimsson is a favorite of my grandfather. My grandfather loved Egil Skallagrimsson. So the Icelandic sagas are today preserved in manuscripts that were written usually on animal skin. And manuscripts means they're handwritten. So there's about 700 manuscripts at a library in Iceland called the Árni Magnússon Institute. Some of it's on paper, some of it's on skin. And all of those tell stories of the Viking settlement of Iceland, when the Vikings left Norway and came to Iceland. And then they also tell the story of them leaving Iceland. A couple of them tell the stories of they turned around and they left Iceland. They maybe went back to Norway, or they went to Russia, or in a couple of the sagas they say, oh, and then they went to Greenland and they went to North America. So we have various different stories in the Icelandic saga manuscripts. So this one is a picture of the saga of the Greenlanders. It's actually embedded inside the saga of Olaf Tryggvason, which is also shows up in Heimskringla, in Snorri Sturluson's saga of the kings of Norway. So, Saga of the Greenlanders is one major source of saga evidence of the Vikings in North America. And it is organized into 7 different stories, 7 chapters, and each chapter takes a different sort of ship captain. And I've often taught this saga with my students. It's really interesting to break it down chapter by chapter, because each of these captains kind of does some things right and some things wrong. And you can kind of compare what makes a good captain, what's a good expedition, what should a captain do, and what shouldn't he do. Bjarni gets made fun of because he spots land, but he doesn't actually go explore it. That's a big no-no. If you see land, you should go check it out. Leif gets more praise because Leif comes across a shipwreck and he saves everybody on the shipwreck, so that's a good sign. Then Leif goes exploring the lands that Bjarni didn't explore. Thorvald goes out exploring and gets himself killed by the native inhabitants. So you probably shouldn't go that far from your base, maybe, if you're in a territory. Thorstein gets totally blown off course, wanders around all summer, so that was not very successful. Then you get this gentleman named Karlsefni. His is actually Thorfinn Karlsefni, and Karlsefni could translate. Karl means sort of guy, like middle class man, yeoman, and Efni. So it basically means stuff. So it's the guy with the right stuff. He's got the right stuff. And then it tells the last chapter of Saga of the Greenlanders. I will read that one to you, and it basically puts this woman Freydís as the leader of this final expedition to North America. So I'll read you that one. But that Saga of the Greenlanders is structured sort of voyage by voyage. And there's another one of these manuscripts in the library in Iceland called the Saga of Erik the Red. And it is fascinating because it actually starts with the story of a woman named Aud the Deep-Minded. And Aud the Deep-Minded shows up in several other sagas. She's a well-known character. She is the wife of the King of Scotland, if I remember correctly. And he gets killed. So then she has to run off, and she takes her children with her. And as she's going across the North Atlantic, she's leaving Scotland, and she deposits each of her children. I'm just going to go back to this map one more time. I should have put it in here 10 times, but As she's leaving this area here, she marries off each of her children, one in Orkney, one in the Shetlands, one in the Faroes, and then she herself moves to Iceland. So she sort of deposited her genetic material all over the North Atlantic. And that's the way the saga of Erik the Red begins. It begins by telling us about this woman, and when she got to Iceland, she freed her slaves. She had with her many Irish slaves, and she freed her slaves. Okay, so one of the freed slaves is this Thorbjorn, and he has a daughter named Gudrid. So that's another woman that shows up in another saga. Well, actually, Prophetess is also in this saga, and they're in both sagas. But I've often said the saga of Erik the Red should be called the saga of Gudrid, because it really begins with how the deep-minded is almost like her grandmother, because she brings the family to Iceland, and then the saga kind of ends with the descendants of Gudrid. So this saga is very interesting. When it talks about North America, it's sort of one big voyage that a lot of people went on together to North America instead of several smaller voyages. So these are both, it's like telephone or something, right? There was a real historic incident that happened. Vikings left Iceland and came to North America, and people in Iceland remembered, oh hey, there's a land out there to the west. And they remembered that Erik the Red was part of this, and Leif was part of this, and there was a woman named Gudrid and a woman named Prophetess. They knew all these stories, they knew there were natives there, they knew there were shipwrecks there, but different versions of the stories got remembered, right? Because it's oral, it was a story that was told over and over again, and they're not exactly the same. These two sagas talk about the same events, but in slightly different ways, because it's oral. It's an oral tradition.
Would you like to ask questions here?
Sure.
About what year or century did these oral stories start to get turned into actual literature?
That is a great question. The events themselves are around the year 1000. The oldest ones of these books that we have, they never say really what date they're written, but they will often name the name of a king, or they'll have a sense of who's the lawman. So they believe the earliest sagas were probably written 1175, 1225, so it's a good 200 years after the events, which, you know, it's not terribly long, and for us today that sounds like a really long time, but because if you think, okay, would I remember anything accurately that happened 200 years ago? Probably not, but in a society that doesn't have, you know, the computer and books, people are a lot better at remembering what they're told. And in Viking culture, this was your way to claim land. This was your way to substantiate any kind of legal status, was these oral stories. So I do believe that the sagas were quite a bit more reliable than we might imagine. Some of the manuscripts are dated to as late as like 1350, 1410. The manuscripts themselves, they seem to be rewritten also, right? The sagas get written down, different people write them down. So it's a complex question, but it's a good 300 years on average, probably, between the time of the events and the time of the sagas being written. Okay, so what I really wanted to talk about and share with you was these two different sagas have these two female characters. Erik's daughter, so Prophetess, the daughter of Erik the Red, and Gudrid, the granddaughter of this Irish slave. And I wanted to, so, I'm going to turn the light back on. Yep. Hello! All right. I've tried this talk a couple of different times, and I've been so pleased that hearing stories, there won't be anything on the screen, you just have to listen to me while I read these sagas, and what's great is, like, you'll like them. I think you'll like them. I hope you like them. Everybody else has. Okay, so I'm going to start with chapter 4 from the saga of Erik the Red, and that's the one that I said should probably have been called the saga of Gudrýður, right? Okay. This was a very lean time in Greenland. Those who had gone hunting had poor catches, and some of them had failed to return. In the district there lived a woman named Thorbjörg, a seafaress who was called the Little Prophetess. She was one of 10 sisters, all of whom had the gift of prophecy, and was the only one of them still alive. It was Thorbjörg's custom to spend the winter visiting, one after another, farms to which she had been invited, mostly by people curious to learn their own future or what was in store for the coming year. Since Thorkell was the leading farmer there, people felt it was up to him to try to find out when the hard times that were oppressing them would let up. Thorkell invited the seafarers to visit, and preparations were made to entertain her well, as was the custom of the time, when a woman of this type was received. A high seat was set for her, complete with a cushion. This was to be stuffed with chicken feathers. When she arrived one evening, along with the man who had been sent to fetch her, she was wearing a black mantle with a strap, which was adorned with precious stones down to the hem. About her neck she wore a string of glass beads, and on her hood a black lambskin lined with white catskin. She bore a staff with a knob on the top, adorned with brass set with stones. About her waist she had a link charm belt with a large purse. In it she kept the charms which she needed for her predictions. She wore calfskin boots lined with fur and long sturdy laces, and long pewter knobs on the ends. On her hands she wore gloves of catskin, white and lined with fur. When she entered, everyone was supposed to offer her respectful greetings, and she responded according to how the person appealed to her. Farmer Thorkell took the wise woman by the hand and led her to the seat which he had prepared for her. He then asked her to survey his flock, servants, and buildings. She had little to say about any of this. That evening, tables were set up and food prepared for the seafarers. A porridge of kid's milk was made for her, and as meat she was given the hearts of all the animals there at the farm. She had a spoon of brass and a knife with an ivory shaft, its two halves clasped with bronze bands, and the point of which had broken off. Once the tables had been cleared away, Thorkell approached Thorbjörg and asked her what she thought of the house there and the conduct of the household, and how soon he could expect an answer to what he had asked and everyone wished to know. She answered that she would not reveal this until the next day, after she'd spent the night there. Late the following day, she was provided with things she required to carry out her magic rites. She asked for women who knew the chants required for carrying out magic, which are called ward songs. But such women were not to be found. Then the people of the household were asked if there was anyone with such knowledge. Gudrýður answered, "I have neither magical powers nor the gift of prophecy, but in Iceland my foster mother, Halldís, taught me the chants once called ward songs." Thorbjörg answered, "Then you know more than I expected." Gudrýður said, "These are the sorts of actions to which I intend to take no part, because I am a Christian woman." Thorbjörg answered, "It could be that you could help the people here by doing so, and you'd be no worse a woman for that, but I expect Thorkell to provide me with what I need." Thorkell then urged Gudrýður, who said she would do as he wished. The women formed a warding ring around the platform raised for sorcery, with Thorbjörg perched on top. Gudrýður spoke the chant so well and so beautiful that people there said they had never heard anyone recite it in a fairer voice. The seeress thanked her for her chant. She said many spirits had been attracted who thought the chant fair to hear, though earlier they wished to turn their backs on us and refused to do our bidding. Many things are now clear to me which were earlier concealed from both me and others, and I can tell you that the spell of hardship will last no longer, and times will improve as the spring advances. The bout of illness which has long plagued you will also improve sooner than expected. And you, Gudrýður, I will reward you on the spot for the help you have given me, since your fate is now very clear to me. You will make the most honorable of matches here in Greenland, though you won't be putting down roots here, as your path leads to Iceland, and from you will be descended a long and worthy line. Over all the branches of that family a bright ray will shine. May you fare well now, my child." After that, the wise woman received everyone and told them, answered any of their questions that she could, and many of what she predicted came true. So that is a depiction of Guðríður as we get it from the saga of Erik the Red. A woman who is Christian, but also can be very helpful, very sort of knowledgeable, well-behaved, and an asset to her household. And that helps clarify that's one of many scenes with her. She really is the protagonist of that saga. And she gets, her story goes on. Okay, so we have an impression of Guðríður from that saga. And now I want to read to you from the saga of the Greenlanders, how this same sort of scene of her prophecy, the prophecy of her future, also gets told in the other version of this, the other saga. The saga of the Greenlanders also has a similar event of her prophecy being told to her. And I just want us to compare a little bit how these two scenes portray her as a character. Guðríður was a woman of striking appearance, and wise as well, who knew how to behave among strangers. It was early in the winter when the first of Thorstein Eriksson's companions were stricken by illness, and many of them died there. Thorstein asked that coffins be made for the bodies of those who had died, and they be taken to the ship and secured away there, as when summer comes I intend to take all the bodies back to Eriksfjord. This is in a different part of Greenland. It was not long until the sickness came to Thorstein's house, and his wife, Grimhild, was the first to fall ill. She was a very large woman with the strength of a man, yet she bowed to the illness. Soon after that, Thorstein Eriksson was stricken, and both of them lay ill until Grimhild, the wife of Thorstein the Black, died. After she had died, Thorstein the Black left the main room to seek a plank to place her body on. Guðríður then spoke, "Don't go away long, dear Thorstein." He promised to do as she asked. Thorstein Eriksson then spoke, "Strange are the actions of the mistress of the house, Grimhild. Now she's struggling to raise herself up on the elbow, stretching her feet out from the bedboards and feeling for her shoes." The same lady that had just died. At this, Thorstein the Black returned to Grimhild, and Grimhild collapsed that same instant, with a cracking sound coming from every timber in the room. Thorstein then made a coffin for Grimhild's body and took it away and secured it. He was a large, strong man and needed to call upon all his strength before he managed to remove his wife from the farm. Thorstein Eriksson's condition worsened, and he also died. His wife, Guðríður, was overtaken by grief. All of them were in the main room. Guðríður had been sitting on a stool in front of the bench when her husband, Thorstein, had died. Thorstein the farmer, who was still alive, then took Guðríður from her stool into his arms and sat with her on the bench across from her husband, Thorstein's corpse, and said many encouraging things, consoling her and promising her that he would take her to Eriksfjord with her husband, Thorstein's body, and those of his companions. And we'll invite other people to stay here, and people can provide you with solace and companionship. She thanked him. Thorstein Eriksson then sat up and spoke, her husband. "Where is Guðríður?" 3 times he spoke these words, and she remained silent. Then he spoke to Thorstein the farmer. "Shall I answer his questions or not?" He told her not to answer. Thorstein the farmer then crossed the floor and sat on the chair, and Guðríður on his knee. Then Thorstein the farmer spoke. "What is it you want, namesake?" he said. He answered after a short pause, "I want to tell Guðríður her fate, to make it easier for her to resign herself to my death. For I have gone to a good resting place. I can tell you, Guðríður, that you will be married to an Icelander, and you will live a long life together, and have many descendants, promising bright and fine and sweet and well-scented. You will leave Greenland to go to Norway, and from there to Iceland, and set up house in Iceland. There you will live a long time, outliving your husband. You will travel abroad, go south on a pilgrimage, and return to Iceland to your farm, where a church will be built. There you will remain and take holy orders, and there you will die." At that, Thorstein Eriksson fell back, and his corpse was made ready, and he was taken to the ship. So here we have a slightly different depiction of Guðríður, right, where she is more timid. She's more beholden to Thorstein, both her husband and the farmer there. So a similar sort of event, her fortune getting told, and the fortune is really similar too. You're going to get married here in Greenland, but then you're going to leave. And so the fortune is the same, but the circumstances and her character is different between these two sagas. And what I what I want to try to get to with this comparison, and especially then it gets even more dramatic when we do a comparison of how Freydis, Erik's daughter, is presented in the two different sagas. What I want to point out here is that there seems to be in this oral storytelling, as the story gets passed down, one of the problems is the fact that women were on the Vinland voyage. And as this story gets retold, it is a point of contention and a point of controversy. Was it a good thing to have women along on the voyage? What's the proper role of women in the Viking Age? The sagas are, by giving us these different versions of the account and different depictions of these women, we get a sense that the Viking Age expectations of women were different than medieval expectations of women. And the sagas are trying to work through this difference. In the Viking Age, women had a lot of opportunities, and in the medieval period, they had very few opportunities. And the sagas are sort of struggling with that transition and trying to make sense of these two different stories. So I'm going to show you a really dramatic version. Actually, turn off the lights for just a second so you can see these pictures. So this is the one from Erik's Saga, which we've said is a little more favorable in its depiction of women. Erik's Saga is. And then this Greenland Saga depiction of women. So, okay, so now I'll read those ones to you so you can get the words that go with those images. Okay. Oh, can I do it the other way? Yeah. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so we will start with Erik the Red's account of Freydis, Erik's daughter. One morning, as spring advanced, they noticed a large number of hide-covered boats rowing up from the south around the point. There were so many of these native boats that it looked as if bits of coal had been tossed over the water, and there was a pole waving from each boat. They signaled with their shields and began trading with the visitors, who mostly wished to trade for red cloth. They also wanted to purchase swords and spears, but Karlsefni and Snorri forbade this. They traded dark pelts for the cloth, and for each pelt they took cloth in hand, which they bound around their heads. This went on for some time, until there was little cloth left. They then cut the cloth into smaller and smaller pieces, but the natives gave just as much for it, if not more. At this point, a bull, owned by Karlsefni and his companions, ran out from the forest and bellowed loudly. The natives took fright at this, ran to their boats, and rowed off to the south. 3 weeks passed, and there was no sign of them. And just as an aside here, I might mention that, of course, domesticated cattle are not known in Native American cultures, so this is a really interesting detail that the saga has here. After that, they saw a large group of native boats approaching from the south, and as thick as a steady stream. They were waving poles counter-sunwise now, and all of them were shrieking loudly. The men took up their red shields and went towards them. They met and began fighting. A hard barrage rained down, and the natives also had catapults. Karlsefni and Snorri then saw the natives lift up onto poles a large round object about the size of a sheep's gut and black in color, which came flying up on the land and made a threatening noise when it landed. It struck great fear into Karlsefni and his men, who decided their best course of action was to flee upriver, since the native party seemed to be attacking from all sides until they reached a cliff wall where they could put up a good fight. Freydis came out of the camp as they were fleeing. She called out, "Why do you flee from such miserable enemies? Men like you who look to me to be capable of killing them off like sheep. Had I a weapon, I'm sure I would fight better than any of you." They paid no attention to what she said. Freydis wanted to go with them, but she moved somewhat slowly as she was with child. She followed them into the forest, but the natives reached her. She came across a slain man, Thorbjorn Snorrason, who had been struck in the head by a slab of stone. His sword lay beside him, and this she snatched up and prepared to defend herself with it as the native approached her. Freeing one of her breasts from her shift, she smacked the sword with it. This frightened the natives, who turned and ran back to their boats and rowed away. Karlsefni and his men came back to her and praised her luck. So that's this one here. That's this version there. Okay, so a woman who's a bit more, she's not as Christian as Guðríður, she's maybe not as obedient as Guðríður, but she's a super impressive human being. Yes, right? Like, she's yelling at people, she's out there defending herself. So, this is the version of Freydís that we get from the Saga of Erik the Red. Do you want to hear what happens to her in the Saga of the Greenlanders?
Yeah.
Not good.
No.
Okay.
So are the natives in the last story
Native Americans. Yes, absolutely. Like I said, when in North America you would have lots of different native groups. And what's so fascinating is how close the description of Native Americans in this saga reflect what we know of actual Native American technology. It's really incredible that 300 years later they remember things like, oh, they only had stone tools, oh, they didn't like sheep, oh, they really liked red cloth because they'd never seen woven cloth before, right?
Is there enough information there to tell whether they were Hurons or Inuit or
Well, it's also a matter of translation, because some translations will say that they had like birch bark boats versus skin boats, and that can make a big difference. So translators say that probably, and also these native groups changed over 100 years. There was dynamic stuff there, but the Beothic and Newfoundland fit this description pretty well. So, okay. And lactose intolerance is also something that probably would have been for almost every Native American group. So, it's, there's one line of the saga where they try to say what the native language sounded like, and it's, but it doesn't. That linguist hasn't been very helpful to most linguists.
Did they describe things like lactose intolerance?
Well, they say that they in a different account they drank some milk and then the next day they came back really mad. We don't know why, but it doesn't say lactose intolerance, but you could sort of put it together. Yeah. Okay. So this is that chapter 7 that I told you in the Saga of the Greenlanders. It's a separate voyage, okay, led by Freydís. So, discussion soon began again in Greenland of another voyage to Vinland, because the trip seemed to bring men both wealth and renown. The same summer that Karlsefni returned from Vinland, a ship arrived in Greenland from Norway. The skippers were two brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, who spent the winter in Greenland. They were Icelanders from the East Fjords. We now turn to Freydís Eriksdottir, who set out on a journey from Gardar to meet the two brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, and to propose that they all make a journey to Vinland on their ship and have a half share of any profits from it. They agreed to this. From there she went to her brother Leif and asked him to give her the houses he had built in Vinland. He replied, as he had before to others, that he would lend the houses but not give them to anyone. According to an agreement between Freydís and the two brothers, each was to have 30 fighting men aboard their ship and women in addition. Freydís broke the agreement straight away, however, and took 5 extra men, concealing them so that the brothers were not aware of them until they had reached Vinland. They put to sea, having agreed beforehand to try to stick together, if possible, on the way, and they almost managed this. The brothers, however, arrived slightly earlier and had unloaded their ship and carried their belongings to Leif's houses when Freydís arrived. Her group unloaded their ship and carried its belongings up to the houses. Freydís then said, "Why are you putting your belongings here?" "We thought," they answered, "that you intended to keep your word to us. Leif lent me the houses, not you." Helgi then spoke, "We brothers will never be a match for your ill will." They removed their things and built themselves a longhouse rather far from the sea on a bank of a lake and settled in well. Freydís had wood cut to make a load for her ship. When the winter came, the brothers suggested they would hold games and arrange entertainment. This went on for a while until disagreements arose. The ill feeling split the party so that the games ceased and each group kept to its own houses. This continued for much of the winter. Early one morning, Freydís got up and dressed, but did not put on any footwear. The weather had left a thick dew on the grass. She took her husband's cape and placed it over her shoulders and went to the brothers' longhouse and came to the doorway. A man had gone out a short while earlier and left the door half open. She opened the door and stood silently in the doorway a while. Finnbogi lay awake and at the other end of the house. He spoke, "What do you want here, Freydis?" She answered, "I want you to get up and come outside. I have to speak to you." He did as she said. They went over to a tree trunk lying near the wall of the house and sat down there. "How do you like it here?" he asked, or she asked. "I think the land has much to offer, but I don't like the ill feeling between our camps, and I think there is no reason for it." "What you say is true," she said, "and I agree, but my purpose in coming here to see you is that I want to exchange ships with the two of you, as you have a larger ship than I do, and I want to leave this place." "I suppose I can agree to that," he said, "if that will please you." After this they parted. She returned home, and Finnbogi went back to his bed. When she climbed back into bed, her cold feet awoke her husband Thorvald, who asked why she was so cold and wet. She answered vehemently, "I went to the brothers to ask to purchase their ship as I wanted a larger ship. They reacted so angrily they struck me and treated me very badly, but you're such a coward that you will repay neither dishonor done to me nor to yourself. I'm now paying the price of being so far away from my home in Greenland, and unless you agree to avenge this, I will divorce you." Not being able to ignore her upbraiding any longer, he told the men to get up as quickly as they could and arm themselves. Having done so, they went at once to the longhouse of the brothers, entered while those inside were still asleep, and took them, tied them up, and once bound, led them outside. Freydis, however, ordered that each of the men who was brought out be killed. Soon all of the men had been killed, and only the women were left, as none of the men wanted to kill them. Freydis then spoke, "Hand me an axe." This was done, and then she attacked the 5 women there and killed them all. They returned to their house after this wicked deed, and it was clear that Freydis was highly pleased with herself and what she had accomplished. So it's the same Freydis, but way worse, right? And sort of you then get the sense that these two women, one's more Christian, one's more pagan, but that also the two sagas are also struggling with this. The one saga is okay, comfortable with these strong females that are doing important things, and the other saga is trying to either have, a cowering woman that needs to be protected all the time, or a woman that's super evil. How much more time should we stop for questions there? Because I could just do a few more. Or we
You
could,
can speak as long as you like. Because
is it okay?
if you have more, let us
I do have a few more. Yeah, I have a few more slides. But
sure.
at this point, most people are like stunned at poor Freydis being a murderess. So there is this question of how true are the sagas in general, and I had a privilege of doing an archaeological excavation on the farm in Iceland where she's said to have returned to. After she leaves Greenland, she settles on a farm in northern Iceland. And there's been an archaeological project on that farm. And it fits very well with the same type of house and all the other details of the saga. There's a church there, just like the sagas say. The sagas also tell us that Erik the Red had a wife named Thjodhild, who wanted a church built on her farm, and they found the remains of a small church near what is still called Erik's Fjord in Greenland. And that also has good evidence of, it also fits, I'm going to skip this part because this is a big complicated thing, but trust me, there's amazing details in the sagas that have archaeological correspondence to them.
About what year were people beginning to meet Christianity?
The year 1000. The year 1000 is when Iceland converted to Christianity. It's the same time. It's the same time as North America is being discovered. The Viking Age is just a fascinating boiling pot of transition. There's so many changes happening in Viking culture at the same time. So if we take a kind of aggregate of all the different sagas, what's the role of the female characters in those sagas? So they, in many cases, are independent enough to be able to just declare themselves divorced. That happens in quite a few sagas, that a woman will get upset with her husband and declare herself divorced. Things often turn out badly if a woman is not consulted about who she should marry. Although a father could arrange a marriage, it generally was not agreed as a good idea. Seems in most of the sagas, women make a lot of decisions about who to hire. They hire servants, they decide what gets served. And in some cases, they can actually be the protagonist of a saga. There is one saga where it follows the whole life of Gudrun, Osvif's daughter. The whole saga is all about her, as the saga of Laxela. And there are many minor female characters who follow. I don't know if you guys have heard of the Schnell test for Hollywood films. You need to have more than one female character. They both need a name. They need to talk to each other and talk about something other than men. And you wouldn't believe how many movies fail that test. So the sagas actually usually pass that test. In most sagas, there are women who have names and they talk to each other about something other than men. So just in that simple case, they're light years ahead of Hollywood. Yeah. And it's about their intelligence, but it is also sometimes about their looks. And you can have women who are bold, they speak their mind. But you also see, like with Freydis, when she's like, you men are being miserable, you know, why are you fleeing? This happens in a lot of sagas too, that women's role is to remind men of their obligations and to encourage them to stand up for the family honor. So they call that the goader role. They're goading their husbands into doing something. And we may or may not think that's a favorable depiction. I don't know. But it at least was important in an honor society. It was very important that the women were just as concerned with issues of honor as men were. And, you know, and then you have the typical thing where poets could be fighting over a beautiful woman. So, you know, the sagas also have some stereotypes. But the sagas give us this shield maiden character, shows up in quite a few sagas. And that's probably what Freydis is kind of channeling when she picks up that sword and strikes her breast. She's picking up on this idea of, you guys maybe have heard of the Valkyries, these warrior women. So the sagas have these warrior women types in them. And a recent archaeological find in Denmark, this isn't very big, it's an amulet. Amulet just about 1.5 inches, 2 inches tall. But it shows very clearly shield, sword, really long hair, and a dress. So cool, very cool. That's actually one of the best. And a new grave has been discovered recently of a full sort of woman in a full warrior outfit. So there is archaeological evidence to support this, but there are sagas and other historic records that do show in the Viking Age, women could actively participate. But the sagas also have, because the sagas weren't written in the Viking Age, the sagas are written 300 years later when Christianity has set up different dynamics of what the proper role is of women. And so the sagas, there are other sagas that have, if there's a woman in it, she's most often the antagonist. And even women that you might like in one account, like Freydis, in another account, she's depicted more negatively. So that is maybe not an answer to the question of how are women depicted in the Icelandic sagas, but is meant to at least show you that it's a complex, changing illustration of how the role of women in society, both in the Viking Age and the medieval period, was a point of contention and controversy as society struggled to figure out the proper role of women. Wow.
In northern part of Europe, women are much further along than here. Look at the American Congress, and 19% of women
And in Norway, this happened.
50,
And
yeah.
they had a prime minister who was there for 8 years.
Yeah.
And Denmark had a prime minister who was a woman. It sort of carries on from the Viking Age.
Yeah, and the first democratically elected Iceland had a female president.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, this is definitely one of the things that I don't know if there's always continuity, because I think in the medieval period there was a lot of pressure for women to be more subdued. But by the 15th century, you get Queen Margrethe
Yeah.
that unites the Scandinavian countries. And there's been, I think, a strain of this being culturally okay. It was definitely culturally okay in the Viking Age. There were strong women in the Viking Age. And I think although there was pressure to sort of change that, it did have enough, there was enough memory of that I think. I don't know if I would say it was always that way, because I think in the medieval period they did manage to impose a more standard gender dynamics. Yeah. Yeah.
Do we know the gender of the people who wrote the sagas down?
There are scriptoria in Iceland, places that we believe a lot of sagas were written down and transcribed. And at least in a couple of those cases, historians today are doing research, and they think that there were quite a few women that were participating in the writing that knew how to read. Any of the abbeys, any of the nuns, it wouldn't have just been priests and monks that knew how to write. It was also abbeys and nuns who knew how to write. So it would have been less of them. There would have been fewer women that knew how to write, but at least some of the scriptoria in Iceland were probably nunneries. And so, yeah, it's a good question, but it would not have been exclusively a male occupation. Very good. Yeah.
And what is the difference is because of the different places the culture grew up. The northern areas, different climate, different economy, different background of legend, whereas the church was coming from Rome and the Middle East and so on, with their whole tradition of male dominance and control of writing and so on.
That's right, yeah. No, it's definitely the clash of two different cultures, and a fascinating sort of effort to untangle that and to make it make sense in Scandinavia. And that's part of what you see in the sagas, is struggling to make Christianity work in that environment, in that place. That's a really good point. Of course, it's a whole long tradition there. Thank you. Yeah?
This is sort of changing the subject, but we always say you don't know what happened, why the people left.
Uh-huh.
I just read a story, and I don't remember the name of the book or anything, that said that there was a volcanic eruption in the Pacific that went over that area that made it gradually cool down for about 400 years and made it uninhabitable for them to live.
The Smithsonian has an article in it that just came out.
That's where I must have read it.
Yeah.
I just got my Smithsonian magazine.
There's, I haven't read that magazine. When I was working on the Vikings exhibition, at that time, Jared Diamond's sort of book had just come out about collapse, and a lot of the blame was being placed on the Greenlanders being unable, the descendants of Erik the Red being unable to adapt to native Inuit sort of hunting techniques, being too stuck to the idea that they had to have cattle and they had to have churches and they wanted wool clothing, all these things that don't really fit in Greenland very well. So when I was there, that was kind of the explanation, and they were trying to, Tom McGovern, who I don't know if that article quotes him, but Tom McGovern is an environmental archaeologist, and he's been sort of against the idea of saying, it got cold and they died. Right? That there are ways that, other cultures.
They did mention about the cows and things like that.
Okay.
And seal hunting, that they would use the seals.
Right. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, they were just saying that they didn't only need the cows to survive. They adapted some of the local kind of customs of hunting seals. And they would travel north to hunt a specific type of seal.
Absolutely, and that is another big part of ongoing research in this field, is to try to understand who were the native peoples, why did the Greenlanders leave, what happened to those cultures there. But that idea of seal hunting, certainly this kind of explains how they even found Baffin Island as they go further up the Greenlandic coast. So it's a complex story, but I think, yeah, volcanic eruptions definitely changed the climate, and the Viking Age was probably about as warm as it is today, or maybe even slightly warmer in the Viking Age. So when they first got to Greenland, things would have been easier for them. And then as the climate naturally cooled, it would have been difficult for them, and one volcanic eruption would have definitely pushed it over the edge. So there's a lot of, that's another great field is environmental science and how that affects the Viking Age. Okay, 2 more questions. So
what language are the sagas written in?
It's one of the great things about the sagas is while most everything written down in the medieval period is written in Latin, right, the language of the church, almost all books are written in Latin in Europe, but in Iceland the sagas are all written in basically Icelandic. And Icelandic and Norwegian and Danish and Swedish in the Viking Age were almost the same language, right? Over time those languages have diversified and are really different today, but in the Viking Age, Vikings could have gone all over the Viking world and spoke, and even England, even the language they were speaking in England was much closer to almost mutually intelligible. So the language of some people say it's Old Norse. Icelanders, of course, say it's Old Icelandic. Norwegians say it's Old Norwegian. So it's, the point is it's a vernacular language. It's not the language of the church. And so that's one of the reasons why the sagas are kind of, they're talking about everyday people, right? They're talking about these things that are happening, and it's not always about kings and princesses. It's unusual literature for caring about everyday happenings in the native language. Very unusual for medieval literature.
That was actually my question. So Finnish is really the only different language from that region?
Finnish comes from a different family, and it probably was on the Scandinavian peninsula much longer than the Scandinavian languages have been there, because it has roots, very deep roots. But it's not mutually intelligible. Okay. Oh, there is actually one more back, but I guess.
Any more questions?
I got one.
Okay. She has two.
So I take it there's no descendants of these people?
In Greenland?
Or any place?
Oh, well, certainly that's, people who want to believe in the Kensington runestone and that. I mean, and there's supposedly word of some tribes in North America. There's an ongoing, I don't have any, I like the idea of, personally like this theory that many of the Greenlanders went back to Iceland, because that we do have evidence of that. We have records in Iceland of people leaving, young couples leaving Greenland and moving back to Iceland in the medieval period. So I think some of it was just back migration to Scandinavia, and maybe some of them ended up in North America, but it's a complicated, it was only about 6,000 people at its peak, so it was never a very big settlement in Greenland.
So there's no genetic testing of the remains that have been found, whatever DNA stuff?
There was recently some article in the news about an Icelandic line of people in Iceland that seem to have Native American DNA in it, but there's no, I mean, you can test the graves in Greenland, but they'll show you that they're Scandinavian stock. So there's very little evidence of inbreeding or intermixing between the Inuit in Greenland and the descendants of Erik the Red in Greenland. Yeah, one last thing.
Yeah, I was going to do the graves, I don't know how many there are, do the graves show any of this balance of male-female position?
That is a great question. So, gosh, yeah, I know I have a slide of it here somewhere, but just really quickly, I know we're out of time, but here on this coast of as you're sailing into Vik, there are 3 large burial mounds there, gigantic burial mounds from the Viking Age, and that have been excavated. There's actually more. There's many more along that coast, but 3 were excavated. How many have been to the ship museum in Oslo? right? So of those 3 ship burials, 1 is a super high status woman. So there's 3 ship burials there, 2 are male, the skeletal remains in those ship burials are men, and then there's a 3rd one, even more elaborate than the male burials, and the ship is more beautiful, I mean super elaborately carved, there's carts, there's tapestries, there's everything in there. So you have archaeological evidence in the graves of very high status women. We have some boat burials in Iceland where it's a lot of women are being buried in these boat burials just like men. It's in around Birka here in Sweden. There's women that are at a trade site, very elaborate, seem to be active in trade sites. In Russia, this is Lake Ladoga in Russia, that's a huge trade town, lots of female burials there too. So women were certainly involved in trading, women were certainly involved in exploring North America, and now we also have pretty good evidence that women were involved in some of the raids. But I wouldn't say the ratio was 1 to 1. I mean, I think it was an extraordinary woman. It wasn't necessarily all of them, but because there was some. But yeah, you could do it if you really wanted to. I guess is kind of the point.
Well, thank you very much.